The largest economic bubble in modern history, several orders of magnitude larger than the 2008 market meltdown, is currently playing out in China, and it is about to burst. The facts are that this is a trillion-dollar-plus crisis, which will be detailed in this video. A Great Recession is one that is several orders of magnitude worse than the 2008 market crash. Decades of bad policy, fictitious money, and expansion at the expense of the very foundation are all coming to a head, possibly in a very short time, and it's not just China that's about to implode. Its consequences will be felt all over the world, from Wall Street to Main Street, Australia to the United Kingdom. This will be far worse than the 2008 recession and several orders of magnitude worse than the current pandemic lockdowns or supply chain challenges. This has been a problem for years that China has been able to postpone through creative financial measures, but it is quickly running out of options to push the can down the road even further. China has what is easily the largest Ponzi scheme in history, which is about to implode on itself. This video will explain why this is about to happen and how every aspect of our lives will most likely be impacted. Before we begin, let me state that there is a fine line between being informed and being scared, and the purpose of this video is not to instill fear, but rather to ensure that you have this information on your radar. We discovered a lot while researching for this video, and it's all public information that you can easily find. So, let us all jump into the biggest bubble ever. This is as succinctly as I can explain the problem. Real estate accounts for nearly 1/3 of China's GDP and is owned by an estimated 70% of Chinese households. Real estate is a source of wealth. Even so, there are currently 65 million vacant homes. The Chinese have put their money into the most stable investments in their country, which are not stocks or foreign investments. It is real estate. Because China has long been a closed country, foreign non-governmental sanction. Investing is not an option for its citizens. Everything is controlled and regulated by the government. One of the reasons for China's staggering 65 million vacant homes is that real estate has long been regarded as one of the only secure investments. Banks are eager to lend to contractors who will construct housing. Nonetheless, these contractors have continued to develop and build, despite the fact that many buildings remain completely vacant and that many projects are still many years away from breaking ground. They used the funds raised from the construction of one building to fund the construction of another. This is only possible if the economy continues to grow. When the pandemic shut down the Chinese economy and caused economies around the world to stutter, all of that vacant housing became a huge liability with only theoretical value on paper. In fact, coveted lockdowns have caused many developers to be unable to complete hundreds of massive apartment projects, and they have already defaulted on their loans. Developers have long used a pre-sale strategy in which they take out a loan to build one property and then use the funds from that project to begin construction on another. It is estimated that 85% of construction projects are funded in this manner, putting developers massively over-leveraged in unfinished properties. People are making mortgage payments on properties that aren't even built. Yet can you imagine buying a first, second, or third property that is several years from completion? That is far worse than the subprime loans that led to the 2008 global recession. At least then the property asset actually existed here. It does not. It's similar to a Ponzi scheme in that it only works so long as investors are eager to fund the projects, and that's not the case right now. Mortgage payments for properties or work was halted or stopped by Chinese citizens. This is a more than $300 billion crisis. The Chinese government is grappling with a $148 billion bailout and has proposed a grace period for mortgage holders. It is important to remember at this point that the lack of investment opportunities for the average citizen has left real estate as the only viable option. There are more second home buyers and nearly as many third-time buyers as first-time buyers. As a result, the average Chinese citizen is heavily leveraged in investments in vacant properties or paying a mortgage on property that has not yet been built, rather than stocks, bonds, 401ks, mutual funds for investment, precious metals, or even cryptocurrencies. Many Chinese citizens are so outraged that they have taken to the streets to demand that their money be returned to them by the banks. The Chinese government's response has been to send in tanks and troops to establish order and to freeze their citizens' deposits. Why is it really bad? China is the second largest economy in the world. Two important numbers to pay attention to are 72% and $92 trillion. First, the 72% property sales fell 72% compared to the same period last year. There is a clear sign that Chinese investors no longer view real estate as a safe investment. so money is not going into this Ponzi scheme any longer. The Chinese are also refusing to make mortgage payments on stalled housing projects, forcing developers to default on their loans if those payments stop coming in. This is where the $92 trillion enter the picture. This is the estimated exposure to the real estate market. More than half of that is in the form of mortgage loans. These are genuine and scary numbers that are well documented. $92 trillion is 12 zeros. It's the equivalent of 565 Jeff Bezos. It's 3/4 of China's total GDP. It's more than the entire GDP of Germany. The combined $92 trillion of France and the United Kingdom is 159 times greater than the total number of US dollars in circulation. The Greek debt crisis of 2015 sent tiny shock waves around the world that are still being felt today. That was a negligible portion of the $92 trillion. The 2008 subprime housing crisis in the United States, which plunged the world into recession, was one of the 5 worst financial crises the world has ever seen, resulting in a loss of more than $2 trillion from the global economy. It was roughly 1/5 the size of the looming Chinese crisis. You may have heard of Evergrande because it went bankrupt for over $300 billion. But do you know the other major real estate development companies, Sunik Kaiser Group, China, Ouyam and Shimon Group, have all been delisted from China's financial markets? The list of companies being delisted from the US stock market is growing by the day, as Chinese companies refuse to report how bad things really are under disclosures required for listing on US exchanges. Over 260 Chinese stocks may be delisted from US exchanges because they do not meet third-party impartial international auditing requirements, potentially deflating stock markets to the tune of $13 trillion. Using the same analogy, that's equivalent to 8 Jeff Bezos. How bad will things get? Unfortunately, we don't know how bad things will get before they get better. China doesn't have an excellent track record of reporting accurate numbers, so we don't know where the bottom of this imminent collapse really could be. It's difficult to tell even how the collapse will occur. It's been known about and predicted almost every year since 2016. Yet it only seems to darken in scope. Currently, the ruling Chinese Communist Party has lowered interest rates, bailed out developers to encourage them to finish projects, and injected massive amounts of cash into their economy, causing bond market gains as they encourage builders to finish projects under penalty of imprisonment. Will the new housing projects be habitable as corners are cut? Will there be confident buyers? Or will the new housing simply add to the 65 million vacant properties? Many Chinese citizens are being frozen by the Chinese government. $6 billion in deposits are held in bank accounts. They had already continued to lower the reserve requirements for their banks to keep their economy chugging along unfettered. This means that banks could collapse if more than 10% other people withdraw their money simultaneously. That low reserve amount means that money has been lent again and again and again, and it doesn't exist, but on paper somewhere, and most of it has been pumped into more and more real estate projects that have yet to even break ground. All of the CCP's efforts right now have only managed to kick the can down the road a little further, but they're running out of road. Should we cry wolf at this point? The evidence is all there that a wolf is at the door. I've seen predictions of China's imminent collapse, ranging from next week to next year, when hundreds of millions of bond payments are due. An accurate forecast is also tricky because of the absolute control over its markets that the CCP has. They have for decades been allowed to manipulate their currency on the global stage. They have grown the Chinese manufacturing capability to beat 30 of the world's total output. Big banks, national banks and credit agencies are all afraid to reveal the truth and downgrade the Chinese economy for fear of the panic that will occur. At the same time, China is heavily invested in other failing economies, most notably Sri Lanka. Their policy of garnering support on the world stage through debt trap diplomacy has resulted in countries that are currently reeling from inflation and recession. They are unlikely to receive monetary compensation for these investments, which could help them with the current crisis. China may sell off its interests and exposure in the United States in order to raise capital to keep its government running. This could have a significant impact on the US market. China's problems are more than just a real estate issue. The global consumer market is shrinking, bringing less revenue into the country and dropping their GDP. There's a massive depth in the country's high-speed railway network that is flashy, but operating at less than 40% of its capacity. Coveted lockdowns have shutter factories, reduce freight and cargo output, force citizens out of jobs and lock them in their homes. The citizens are in a constant state of unrest under the zero-coveted policies, though that rarely takes the form of physical revolt because of the heavy-handed authoritarian nature of the government. It is often quietly done through social media work, slowdowns or tiny acts or rebellion. That furthers erode GDP. Banks in China are declaring bankruptcy at an alarming rate, because their fractional reserves are just 10% and they are way over leverage. They are up to 10 times over leverage, as they have loaned out money that they essentially didn't have for projects that will never be completed. Why are they telling you that a China crisis is easy to dismiss? After all, it's a long way away. What impact could their demise have on us? First, China accounts for nearly 1/3 of global manufacturing output. This includes everything from integrated circuits and insulators for power plants to plastics and building materials. Imagine 1/3 of all the parts that you need to keep your country's grid functioning, your country's houses being built and your transit systems running suddenly in scarcity or questionable supply. Second, as China finds itself in deep need of generating actual tangible capital, it will dump the debt it bought from other countries. China has extended loans for decades to developing in developed countries. The country holds over $1 trillion in US Treasury bonds alone. As national banks enter a monetary tightening cycle worldwide, China will likely use its investments in other countries to hold its way over those countries. All of these problems in the Chinese economy have eroded their people's confidence in the banks and government, and it has scared away all the international investors. We know that, based on China's historical actions, there are several moves it may make that will hurt the world while it tries to save itself without investors and money coming in default. It's inevitable in September, which is why many say this will melt down within the next 28 to 30 days. More than $2 billion in high-yield property developer debt is due, which is twice as much as was due this month, when these same developers begged for extensions. When China's collapsing payments in the CCP run out of options, they will most likely go to the CEOs of these development companies and their own wealthy investors. China is likely to dump assets and massively restructure its economy as it moves away from high GDP and closer to communism. While the CCP could still drag this out for another 5 years, it is very likely that we will see the first stutter step of a much larger fall as early as next month. What should you expect? I'm not going to gloss over or minimize this, as world leaders and banks are doing right now. If you're going to brace for the worst, I don't recommend that approach, because the worst is probably the worst that we've seen on a global scale. This house of cards encompasses the entire world, depending on your country's fiscal, industrial, and manufacturing ties to China. Some countries will be hit harder by the collapse or massive restructuring than others. If you've already felt the effects of Chinese lockdowns in the form of product scarcity or problems at your country's ports, expect things to get much worse in the coming months. If your country's infrastructure is reliant on Chinese electrical components and machinery, you should plan for future grid outages. I'm not a financial planner, so I can't give you any investment advice. I can tell you that in the past, when faced with a massive economic downturn, precious metals, land, and resources have all performed similarly, many from a preparedness standpoint. I think it's more critical than ever that people prep food, water, and energy to sustain themselves for a year or more. We have become globally over-dependent. The problems of another country are now ours as well. China's problem is reaching a point where it can no longer be kicked further down the road. It's unraveling with ever more tremendous momentum. Prep for the worst as always. Stay safe out there.